No, there'll be time code on here. If we go through the whole tape, it'll be time coded. Whenever you're ready.
Just start off, go straight. Okay. Hi, my name's Emil Dickstein here in Youngstown, Ohio. And it's one of those oddball, all the forks in the road is how I got here. My mom's side all came from Eastern Europe and Russia, and they came over in the 19th century and had nothing to do with Western Europe. My dad's side came from Eastern Europe. We're in Vienna, which is the point here, and came to the United States. And the question is, how did this come to be? My father's mother was born actually in Poland. And her father, so this is my great-grandfather, was a gentleman named Ozias Kamp, or Yehoshua. And they came from a little shtetl town called Szczecin, S-C-Z-U-C-I-N, in Galicia, now southeastern Poland, a little nothing place. I've seen pictures and the like. It was a one-horse town then, it's a one-horse town now. He was born there in 1842, average family, nothing special. Apparently, the story goes that he had a shotgun wedding with his first wife. I do have some records from those days. He was only 18 or so when he got married. She was 19. Her name was Devorah Feigenhaft. Anyway, it was apparently a rather furious marriage. She was an early feminist of the day. She was pregnant, got really incensed at him one day, whatever his personality was like. Apparently threw all the Shabbat things, the candlesticks and the whole bit on the floor, walked out and said, to hell with this. He divorced her through the rabbi. Their kid actually was born but died at 8 months old, Mortka Shaul. And then she died the following year, got sick and died, and it was evidence, obviously, to the community of just how horrible a sin she had committed. This was the story I was told. He got married a second time to Blumela Scheindl of Szczecin. A nice person, apparently, although after 7 kids, he divorced her as well. They were married when he was 25. Of the 7 kids, actually 4 survived the Holocaust, going to places like Hollywood, Baltimore, Maryland, Melbourne, Australia, and the like. Now, one of the kids, named Max, went to Vienna. I don't know why, but he was the first of that group of comps, K-A-M-P-Fs, to go to Vienna. Any which way, Ozias married his third wife, Charlotte Rosenstraw, who would be my great-great-grandmother, and March 10th of 1890 in Szczecin, which is actually a long time after he had already had 8 kids by her. He finally decided to finalize the marriage. So Ozias must have been quite a character, although in those days, too, I'm sure there was a religious marriage, even though there may not have been the civil marriage dated. Now, Ozias' claim to fame was that in that area of Poland, there was an uprising in the 1870s or 1880s, I'm not sure the exact date, and the landlord of the area, and you could almost call him a feudal landlord because he had such control of the area, apparently was a pretty nasty guy, and the townsfolk went after him with pitchforks, and he hid the guy in his haystack. And for a reward, after things settled down, he was awarded a certificate that he could open up a tobacco shop and tavern, which is to say he was given a liquor license. And as such, became really quite prosperous. Also, unusual for that time and place, at least in the, certainly for the non-Jewish community, but to some extent the Jewish community, he was literate. And as such, literate both in Hebrew, Yiddish, and in Polish. And he became a legal advisor for the peasantry and a letter writer for the peasantry, along with being a tavern keeper and shopkeeper. And as such, gained a sufficient amount of money that in 1892, when he was 50, the son by the second marriage, who was in Vienna, has been writing to him to say, get out of Szczecin, it's a lousy place, come to Vienna, the big city. And one day he told his wife, Charlotte, we're going to do it. And my grandmother, of blessed memory, remembers at the age of 3, this was in 1892, she was born in 1889, but being bundled, she was the youngest, with all her brothers and sisters, there were 8 of them, and into this ox cart, and of leaving Poland singing the Polish national anthem. I mean, this is her earliest memory. She remembered a few words of Polish and then was taught German. And so they all left in 1892 and settled in Vienna. And that's how they got to Vienna. And they went to the usual Jewish district in Vienna and established themselves and with their families. Backing up for a second, my my father's father, that's my father's mother's side. My father's side, his name was Emil Dickstein. I have that name. Unfortunately, he died about a month before I was born, and that's how I ended up with the name Emil instead of a normal name. I shouldn't say that. Edit that one out. But he was born also in Shtetl in Galicia named Korolovka, which has been Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Russia, and is now Ukraine again. Any which way, there were 4 kids. A side note is that my name is Dickstein, but it really should be Goddesfeld, because his parents didn't bother to get around to having a civil marriage until after he and 2 sisters were born, and then they got married. So the civil authorities didn't recognize their births as legitimate and were considered bastards, and they wouldn't let the kids have their father's name. So the mother's name was Dickstein, the father's name was Goddesfeld. The 4th kid, Tante Becky, was a Goddesfeld of interest. Any which way, in the first years of the 20th century, he was around 20 or so, as he was born in 1884, the family again had some urge to move on. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, Emil, had friends who were in Vienna, and they talked him into coming there. The great Tante Becky, the one sister, we had relatives in New York from a previous generation, went to New York and set up a family there, did extremely well. And the other 2 sisters stayed in Stettin, and their families and all were perished in the Holocaust. But grandfather Emil came to Austria and set up a shop in the district. Osius, incidentally, when he came to Vienna, he had been a tobaccoist and a liquor salesman and had written papers. He did the same thing in a shop in Vienna as well. So his daughter, Osius's daughter, Lotta, or Lily, or Leah, she was always called Lily when I grew up, who had come to Vienna, and grandfather Emil met, fell in love. They married on May 26, 1912 in Vienna in a typical Jewish wedding. They were all Orthodox Jews, reasonably observant, but certainly influenced to some extent by secular ways. They opened up again, a corner shop, grocery store, mom and pop type of place in Vienna, and were content. Had a couple of kids, my father, Leopold, known as Poldy or Paul, and my aunt Ilse. My dad was born in 1914, and my aunt Ilse in 1920. They had typical childhoods in Vienna, school, Hebrew school. On Sundays, on Saturday, Shabbat, they would go to temple. At least my father would. My aunt would usually skip out. They would on Sundays visit the relatives, forcibly, and then were permitted to enjoy themselves. He traveled a lot, my father, in Europe. He enjoyed himself a great deal. There's a story, he had a motorcycle and traveled, which is the most atypical thing knowing him that I can think of, but that's how things were. My father was extremely talented. He did extremely well in school. He went to the University of Vienna and graduated with top honors. He went to through the Hebrew school system. I have a matriculation and his graduation papers from that, high honors. And he wanted to become a concert pianist. He was very talented. The He went to the University of Vienna's School of Music, the Music Academy, and graduated with high honors there too. Apparently, this was the first inklings of some degree of anti-Semitism. This is in the 1930s that he remembered in terms of that he knew his instruments extremely well, but one of the tests for passing had to be through one of the teachers who would ask you about musical instruments, and the teacher was rather anti-Semitic and picked of all the instruments to make him discuss the pipe organ. And he felt he was very lucky that he happened to know enough to be able to get through that class, and he still graduated with honors. He wanted to become a concert pianist. My grandparents of the day said that no good Jewish boy is going to go off being, a concert pianist. You should be a doctor instead. So he went to the University of Vienna Medical School instead. And this was in 1935, I believe. My aunt was much younger. She wasn't going to a lot of parties. She was enjoying herself. Obviously, things were going sour in Vienna at the time. He knew it. His parents knew it. They'd been talking about getting out. But my dad was in medical school. He wanted to finish medical school and get about with things. My grandfather could see the handwriting on the wall. He was seeing how the Nazis were around and how everything was doing. Well, again, my grandfather Emil had this sister, Tante Becky, in New York, and who said, get out, and my grandparents decided it would not be such a bad idea. And the catalyst of the whole thing was with my Aunt Ilsa, who was 17 or 18 at the time, and a friend of hers apparently had been picked up by a Nazi and raped or something, and nothing had happened, and my aunt was extremely attractive, and they could just see what was going to happen. They figured, let's get out of here. Now, this is already 1939. This is very late in the game. But because of my Tante Becky's, the family's wealth, they were garish. I'm told that my father visited New York around 1948 when the first television sets came out, and the family had this huge estate on Long Island, and every single room had a television set. But anyway, the family in New York vouched, and as such, the family in Vienna were able to get visas, and so my grandmother had my aunt come out first, and she left in February of 1939 and went to New York City. My grandmother had actually realized some of the financial problems getting money out and the like, had converted all their portable money into gemstones, sewn it into my aunt's overcoat without telling her, told her don't lose the overcoat, and she was, took the train through to France and left and arrived in New York and kept the overcoat, thankfully. My grandmother, grandmother followed a couple of months later in April of 1939, I believe, something like that, and left successfully. Now, my father had only one more year of medical school to go, and he wanted to finish. And he said he was staying. And it was only a little later in the summer of 1939 that he suddenly realized, oh my God, what have I done? I mean, at this point, people were being rounded up. This is, of course, just before World War II started. He had this sudden light bulb, that get me out of here. And at that point, it was too late to get a visa out from Austria. All the connections had been shut down. So around July 24th of 1939, he and a friend, Robert, decided they were going to sneak across the border from Austria into Switzerland, neutral ground. Typically, they waited till midnight. They found a barbed wire crossing and were immediately caught by the Nazis. And asked them, what are they doing there? And they said, well, they got lost. And they were just trying to find their way, and they were trying to get into Switzerland. And the Nazis said, okay, well, you have 48 hours to prove your point, or else you're going to be shot. So they were in one of the Gestapo stations, or one of the police stations, I guess, not Gestapo, police stations. They are trying their very best to figure out how to come up with something in Switzerland. Well, my father, who had traveled extensively, had made friends with people in Switzerland, including a guy who belonged to HIS, H-I-S, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and managed, after about 36 hours, this was getting close to the 48-hour mark, And he may have dramatized this, of course, too, but it must have been some deal of pressure to get a hold of the guy who managed to phony up some paperwork and to say that, yes, that this was perfectly correct, the two of them were to be going into Switzerland and they had jobs available for them on a farm, and that this was all total upright and the like. And as such, and I brought my dad's passport, Deutsches Reichspass, which documents all this stuff, actually. And it's J for Juden, and all these official papers. There's a picture of him as a young man. Again, I couldn't imagine him actually looking like that. He got stodgy when he got older. And here it is on July 26th, 1939. They got the official okay through the Nazi authorities and through the German General Consulate in Zurich that he and his friend were able to go into Switzerland. Thank goodness. In Switzerland, they did find a spot for him while they were trying to work everything else out on a farm where he did manual labor for a month and trying to get an okay to get out. And indeed, another interesting page here in the passport is an immigration visa. This is in English, from the English authorities on August the 2nd. This was some days later, where he was given his okay to get out. And then there is a spot from the French consulate, dated August the 12th, I'm sorry, August the 3rd, in which it gives the okay for the transit to leave from Geneva and cross by train to Cherbourg in France, and then take a boat to New York. That was signed by the Consul General in France. He then desperately tried to arrange transportation out, managed, he and his friend again, to acquire somehow the wherewithal to purchase tickets. I think he must have borrowed money. Left Switzerland on August the 11th, arrived in Cherbourg on August the 12th, took the boat on that day, August the 12th, 1939, from Cherbourg to New York, which was the last boat out of Europe. The last boat out of Europe. The one Jews who came following that the next day, no more boats, ended up in the concentration camps. He arrived, and then war broke out September 1st, 1939, a couple of days later, and the rest is World War II. In New York, unfortunately, this was, of course, times of strong anti-Jewish feeling. I have to add one more thing I forgot to earlier on, which could be re-edited in another spot, about the name Dickstein. Because, again, it might have been Goddesville, but it was Dickstein. In the Polish areas, it was something like Dickstein, spelled D-Y-K-S-T-Y-Z-N or something like that, plus you could spell it 87 different ways. There's no particular Hebrew spelling either. Yiddish spelling is however one wanted to do it. But when the family did move to Vienna, they wanted to make it a more Germanic name, so they Teutonized it into Dickstein, D-I-C-K-S-T-E-I-N, and came up with what I think is an apocryphal kind of thing as to its meaning, in that in German, Dickstein means thick stone, and they say it means like a diamond in the rough. And so that's then the family thing for that, which I always thought was kind of cute. Any which way. So my dad was in New York, as well as my aunt and grandparents. It was nice for them to be together. My grandfather opened up another corner store in New York City. My father found to his chagrin that none of his medical school time would count, which he had kind of anticipated, and then further to his chagrin that his certificate from the University of Vienna wouldn't count either. The American authorities were becoming quite upset with Europe, and they basically gave him no recognition whatsoever. He became really pretty depressed, even somewhat despondent. He talks about the weather and the snow and just feeling awfully miserable. And he went to some classes at City University of New York and just felt, why am I doing this? I learned this stuff, years and years before. This is foolish. He worked some in the corner store, felt, is this, what my life's going to be all about? And was casting about for some way, something else to do. This was now World War II. Is immigrant alien. not much in the way of jobs, not much in the way of opportunities, but he figured his best way was just to go ahead and try to strike out and start over again anyway. So as many college programs as he could find, he applied to as a scholarship student. And luckily enough, or as you know, fate happens, he was accepted as a scholarship student at what was then the College of the Pacific, now the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. It's a Methodist college, and he became the token Jew. He was the only Jew on campus. This was the middle of World War II. And he took the train out and found he loved California. They treated him wonderfully well. And they had agreed to permit him just to take final exams, pass grades. He didn't have to actually attend classes. So he managed to bundle all kinds of classes together and to do 4 years of college work in 2 years. Because he had done all this before, he found he actually was enjoying himself. And he paid his way through school because he had been a talented pianist by working as a pianist in the local bars. And of course also was doing some piano work for recitals and teaching students and the like. But he got a pretty good repertoire of the popular tunes of the day. Any which way, he graduated with high honors. After 2 years, had applied to medical schools all over again and had been accepted at the University of California, San Francisco to medical school. He went there, was a star student, why wouldn't he be, had done it all before, and had a high old time. He had thoroughly enjoyed things. When he went to medical school there, he basically sent word back to my grandparents and aunt that, get out of New York, I'm taking you all to California. They all came out to California. My aunt lives there still, and my grandparents had lived there until they passed on. And my dad did well. He met my mom there in San Francisco as a student. She was a physical therapist. They fell in love, got married. Graduated from medical school, decided he was going to be a obstetrician gynecologist. Went ahead, did residency. Had my brother, who was 2 years older than I, in 1948. I was born December 26, 1950. And set up shop in Oakland, California, where I was born and grew up in 1950. One more interesting thing with the story is that it was about that time that he became an official United States citizen. The Korean War began, and he was drafted after he'd been in practice for a year or two, and assumed he was going to Korea. However, because of his extensive knowledge of languages, he spoke some 6 or 7 fairly fluently, and because of some need for qualified, certified OBGYN doctors and the like, he was actually transferred to Europe and was stationed in Kaiserslautern in Germany in a very cushy spot. He actually was the OB to all the officers and a lot of the wealthier citizens of the area with a lot of free time and a huge staff. He had my mom and my brother and I come over. I was 2 years old, and so my memories of the time are limited. I remember snow for the first time. You don't get that in California. And he had a wonderful time. He traveled extensively throughout Europe. When he came back in '54, his nurse had managed to hold on to a significant number of the patients. He set up practice again, and the rest is basically they lived happily ever after. Just as an addendum about how I got to Youngstown, I grew up in California, went to Berkeley, not knowing what else I was going to do, decided to be a doctor, applied to multiple places, decided I was be interesting to go someplace that was totally out of my culture line. Went to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, to Wake Forest University, Bowman Gray School of Medicine. Finished there. We then went to New York City. My wife, we've been married now 26 years in Metlark, California. Wanted her master's degree in deaf education. I had other career tracks. Decided to not like New York, wanted to go someplace for 1 year before coming back to California. That was in 1978. Came to Youngstown because they had a nice program for a year. And then the inertia set in, and we never left, and here I am. And that's the end of the story.
Very good. That's very good.
Let me go ahead and change tapes here.
Okay,
This is a good spot to change.
Excellent. It really
Thank
is.
that, and I started getting some offers here. And I was thoroughly enjoying myself. I did a good job. I had multiple things, and I decided to look again in the mirror one day and said, why don't I want this is fine. And never regretted it for a second. Although the one other incident with that, which is a nice story, is as a graduation present to ourselves from medical school, we had a week, 2 weeks free. And I called a local travel agent and said, what do you have? I said, I got a great deal for you. Caravan. They've got sand on the floor. It's a Sephardic synagogue. And it was
Yeah, but it sounds like you're describing Berkeley all over again.
Berkeley was wonderful.
Okay.
I love Berkeley. Crushed me when this is my mom's parents had this beautiful house up in the Berkeley Hills, and my grandmother sold it. It was like 66 Poppy Lane.
As a matter of fact, I've got a brother who lives, what is it, right on the other side of the tunnel. What's the first town on the other side?
Walnut Creek.
No, it's the first one.
Hayward, Orinda.
Orinda.
Orinda, yeah.
Yeah, he lives in Orinda. He moved from Ohio about 25 years ago. He thinks that California is the garden center of the universe. Jonathan is now out there, and he thinks that California, he's in Glendale, and he thinks California is the garden center of the universe too.
You want to be wooed, and you go out, and the weather's beautiful, and
Yeah.
it's open, and you go to San Francisco, it's just cosmopolitan there. You get to be there, not too long to realize just what a nuisance. I talk for the drug companies, like Harrods Manor, and the steel firm. There's no place, any place where you'd be able to do this kind of stuff and get away with it.
Well, that's good.
It really is. It's a fine.
The
ride for
amazing
me.
thing to me also is here we're two talking to one another, and our grandparents, great-grandparents were nothing. In other words, yours was a grocery
Corner store, Mom.
Genesis in the United States, I hear very often people of that sort, and this idea of setting up different racial groupings, certain people superior to others genetically, and so on and so forth, and the idea of destroying a specific gene pool for the purpose of supposedly improving the race, well, the human species and everything, if you have...
And actually was somebody of some significance in Europe at the time. He was in Hungary, was currently Hungary and eastern Slovakia, and had vineyards, and was quite involved, and somehow was involved with Fleischmann's yeast, and that was an invention. Some of the relatives